Voilà. Bonsoir à tous et merci.
Good evening, one and all, and thank you all for staying for the debate. We have our guests here on stage. We've just watched Eat Better, a film that describes a new world that is emerging in Africa with new partners, new economic partners, China among others. That is what we are going to be talking this evening with our guests. Good evening. We have with us tonight Mathieu Pellerin, who is a researcher at the French Institute for International Relations and also at the International Crisis Group. You've been working on sub-Saharan Africa, the Sahel, and the relationship between China and Africa. We also have Aisha Dabo, you're co-founder and coordinator of AfricTivistes. So you're an expert in digital governance, social networks, and human rights in the cyberspace. And online, we have Aminata Traoré. She is a former minister. She is an activist, former Minister of Culture of Mali. She has long fought against liberalism and neocolonialism. And we also have online Freddy Nkurikiye, founder of Afrika, Nunya, and advisor to the president of Togo. He focuses on peace and security in Africa, sustainable development, human rights, rule of law. But first, what did you think of the film that we just watched? We've seen Luan, who is a construction worker in Africa, and the sand divers, Thomas. According to you, does it describe the changes that the world has gone through, and especially on the African continent? Mathieu. Yes, thank you. Good evening, everyone. I think this documentary has two main strengths. The first one is that we talk a lot about power, rivalries, China, Russia, their relationship to those countries, their relationship to Western countries. But what we can see here in this film is the fact that, on the one hand, there's a Central African character and an economic operator from China who are both only looking for purchasing power or profit for the Chinese character, because he says that he will be coming back to China, going back to China. So he's setting money aside to build himself a life. That's very far removed from the geopolitical considerations that we are focused on. So it's interesting because it allows us to decenter the relationship between China and Africa. I haven't delved into China-Africa relationship for a while, but it was lost from the past for me, because when China is present, it's like the empire is coming. They come with the herds of Chinese employees, and they tend not to hire local workforce. But what we see in the film here is a Chinese employer who seems to be coming from the provinces in China. He hires a lot of locals. So it deconstructs, so to say, the image that we have, the mental image that we have of the relationships between China and Africa. Let me now turn to you, Mr. Traoré. What does this film tell about the time that we're going through? Well, I found the film very moving because those are human stories, they're life stories, two men from two different countries very far away from one another, Central Africa and China, and those two men are struggling to survive in very difficult conditions. One is they're very ordinary citizens. And while the documentary illustrates very well the recent evolution of the world, China and Africa took very different paths. It's very interesting because the documentary is not showing us CEOs or bosses.
Voilà, je crois qu'on a quelques petits soucis
It looks like we have issues with the connectivity. Can you hear us, Mrs. Traoré?
Aminata, est-ce que vous nous entendez?
Just call me Aminata. Yes, I can hear you.
Je me tourne vers vous, Aisha Dabo.
All right, let me turn to you, Aisha Dabo. As Aminata said, this is a film about life stories.
Ces partenariats qu'on voit de plus en plus sur le continent en Afrique avec la Chine.
These new partnerships that emerge on the African continent with China, among others, do you think they can be an opportunity for citizens on the continent? Well, yes, because if there is a transfer of skills, then it's a good thing. And first, they create jobs. And as we said, the film shows parallel stories. These are people fighting for their livelihoods, and it gives a humane face to decisions that can be taken at higher levels. And the fact that after one contract, the Chinese boss gets 5 more, that just goes to show that there are opportunities. Now, when it comes to employment, well, we don't know if he pays his employees enough, but what's interesting is that investment is happening and there is transfer of knowledge happening. Mr. Freddy Nkurikiye, are you still with us? You're not appearing on the screen anymore. You're back. We're seeing the Chinese in Central Africa through the character of Luan. Is it a token of a new economic order that is happening on the African continent? Good evening, thank you, and good evening, one and all. I'm in Lomé, and just one comment. I'm co-founder of Africa Nunya, not founder, but here I will be speaking from my own perspective. Talking about the new world order, well, the world is a dynamic place. Things are changing, and what is true today will not be true tomorrow. But what I learned from this film, which is extraordinary, and that I watched twice, is that the world is built through converging interests. And I even recognized the buildings, the bank, center of Bangui. So, memories. But it goes to show that, yes, interests need to converge intelligently. The second point is that we need to think differently about the relationship between people. And in the current situation, it's true, it could bode for something different. Even though the relationship between the two parties, China and the Central African Republic, are not equal, there is a new dynamic. They are working towards a shared objective that meets both their needs. And now it's up to African players to make the most of the situation, because as we've seen, there are so many opportunities. when we see this Chinese operator arriving in Bangui with only one contract, and it doesn't take him long to get 5 more contracts, and he's doing really well for himself. So it goes to show that Africa is the land of opportunities. So, a few facts today. China is the main economic partner of Africa, the main investor in strategic sectors such as mining, oil and gas, and telecoms. We've been talking about China in the film, but we could also talk about Russia, which is a military partner, Turkey, the Emirates. Mathieu Pellerin, let me ask you the same question. This Chinese, Russian, Turkish presence in Africa, according to you, does it reveal a new economic order, whether it be political or economic? Well, it is true that it illustrates a change in the world order, because all these countries that you've listed are emerging or re-emerging powers, or powers that have even overtaken Western powers like China economically. And those countries need growth levers on another continent. It's not just China. If we look at China and their investments in Asia, in Latin America, or in Africa, are massive. So they find growth levers everywhere. And as Freddy said, Africa is a land of opportunities, growth, very high growth rate, very high demographic growth. They need infrastructure, they need construction. So for China, it is a land of opportunity. Now, redefining the world order is not seen so much through the economy, but through power relationships between states. And all those states that you've mentioned are already beyond the economic relations. They already started having an form of influence diplomacy, or even military relationships, as you mentioned, Russia. And I won't dwell on this right now, but it illustrates a questioning of liberal values that were put forth in the relationship between Western powers and African countries. Let me give you an example to illustrate what I just said. In 2004, when I was working on those issues, it's an example, but it illustrates what happens almost everywhere between China and Africa. In 2004, Angola decided not to continue their talks with the World Bank because they considered that the World Bank were too tough, and they turned to China. And China gave them a loan against oil. So a very good interest rate, very few conditions, and in exchange, access to natural resources, including oil. So that was the first instance of a change of balance between African countries and Western and other countries. These African countries have found in China and in other partners a way to put all these powers in competition.
As Mr. Nkurikiye explained just recently, I would like to now turn to Madame Traoré. The fact that they are all emerging countries, China, Central African Republic, does that change something in the relationship between the countries? I think that we need to put tonight's discussion in context, because the emergence of the BRICS countries, or the hope that African countries have regarding their development status gives the impression that things are going in the right direction. But we cannot ignore the shocks and upsets because Africa has suffered from the unequal exchanges, from the debt burden, from structural policy problems, and the opportunities to overcome these challenges have been taken away from them. And that isn't what happened with China.
Est-ce que vous nous entendez? On a une petite... Je vous en prie, allez-y.
Please go ahead. So,
si nous nous situons dans le...
So if we look at this documentary, yes, we see people, we see humans, we see tenderness in a world full of upset. But as you have said, I have not, throughout my career, believed in that sort of economic development. We have China, the BRICS countries, but they haven't managed to help us get out of the situation as soon as possible. But why do you say that? Why can they not help Africa get out of this situation? Well, I would say because we have skipped industrialization. We also haven't dealt with the issue of funding. Currently, what we are seeing is that there is a conflict between
Ça va reprendre, je pense.
I think we will get the connection back. But in the meantime, I will turn to you, Aisha Dabo. It's very interesting what Madame Traoré was saying, because she was saying that she does not believe that this will be enough to ensure that Africa can get out of this situation. And I think that resonates with the film, because you see the worker who, first of all, is working with somebody who has several canoes, and then in the end he is able to buy his own canoe and then employs other people, and he's able to earn his own money. Do you think that this is enough? Madame Traoré was talking about the fact that there is a need to industrialize Africa. This step has been skipped throughout Africa's history. So with this relationship that we have between Africa and China, do you think it is going in the right direction? Do you think it is enough to bring more development to the continent? I will answer this question based on my work. I don't think it is enough. If we look at Thomas and the others, you see that at some point the government says that they have to leave. Then we hear that they need to have shoes or specific ID documents. So the conditions aren't there for them to be able to succeed. And that is the case for economic development. And that is the case in other sectors. Yes, it is a wonderful story. He is able to buy his own canoe. But how many others were actually then involved in the rebel groups? Because they did not have the opportunity to buy their own canoes. So as long as we don't have the conditions that created by our governments, we will still be left behind. And I wouldn't say that this is a position of victim. It's just that we are subjected to a number of things by sectors such as the economic sector. So we are suffering because negotiations aren't always in favor of states that are negotiating on behalf of citizens, even if these are economic negotiations for loans that they want to get from, for example, China. If we look at one of the countries in West Africa, I think it might be Zambia. If you look at the port, the airport, they're built, but then they can't pay it back. And this goes on for a number of years. So in my view, we need to be able to renegotiate, but bearing in mind the interests of the country itself, and not only for the current generations, but for future generations as well. That is an interesting point, particularly because what we see in this documentary is that Thomas is able to buy his own canoe. However, he's still working in an informal business, so it is a fragile business. Now let me turn to Freddy. Madam Dabo was very well explaining that the future of the African continent and the new partnerships will depend on the ability of African governments to make the most of this. So how do you see these new partners, these new partnerships with these countries? Yes, so what has happened is that partners are now competing against each other. So we have non-traditional partners that are involved. But when we look at development now, as was being said by Madame Traoré, we have skipped a step. And currently, the important question is, what are the bases of development? We heard about infrastructure. You can't do anything without infrastructure. Second, we also need to create added value. And how do you do that? You create added value through industrialization. But there is a scale that needs to be achieved for industrialization. So currently, Africa needs to struggle to ensure that there is added value in sectors such as agriculture. Having said that, there is also the question of education. Education means that you would then have farmers that have the skills to produce so that they can ensure that their own skills give them opportunities. So we can see that Thomas really worked hard to get his own canoe. So there is also this ability, there is this need to ensure that people acquire skills. Third, there is market access that is vital for African countries because we have the mechanisms right now that give a rating to countries, a credit rating, and it is completely against African countries. I remember in 2022, during the Lomé Financial Summit, there were two cases that were outlined. There was Angola, that was in one situation, and then Argentina, that had far more advantageous conditions for its loans than Angola. So the very fact that you are an African country puts you in an unfavorable position in the financial market. And you have seen that the African Union is trying to launch this idea to have an African credit rating agency. Now, that might also improve development funding opportunities for African countries. There is still a long way to go, but we have to start somewhere. So we need infrastructure, education. We need skills for this industrious young population, and market access. These are all essential. Now, just let me go back to the geopolitical question that I have just asked you. Very concretely, our partnerships are different between the new partners, between China, Russia, and African countries, and those partnerships that existed with the traditional partners in Europe. So I think the problem is that for the last 30, 35 years, since the 80s, we have seen that everything was built on aid for development. And in some countries, for about 25 years, aid for development was about 20% of GDP. So just imagine the repercussions this had on development. If you have 20% of your GDP depending on aid for development, then it means that you are not dependent on your own productive capacity. And currently, we are trying to deal with that. Then now you have the Chinese who have come in, and they have provided infrastructure, but this is something that you, of course, need to negotiate on. In fact, China has delayed quite a number of projects that they were going to start because they saw that they were not going to work. But what happens with Russia? Currently, we're saying that Russia is not doing anything for development, but they are not asking for anything. They are focused only on security matters, and this needs to be taken into consideration in this evolving geopolitical situation. So they are only focused on security. So this is something that I saw in Bangui about 15 years ago. Things did happen, but we can come back to that in a minute. And then there are other countries, such as Turkey, that have military technology. And they can provide a military advantage for African countries because this makes them more competitive and more robust. So if you look at the difficult conditions that African countries have regarding access to what they need for development, they are better able to negotiate with those partners. But we have to see whether this is not going to undermine the whole processes of development in our countries. But if we look at deregulation and competition, I think that is a way of our countries moving forward. It is through this competition of partnerships. I think we need to allow African countries to have more partnerships. Why? Because who is more concerned about our fate than Africans themselves? We need to broaden our circle of friends. I think this is one of the questions that we need to ask ourselves.
Mathieu Pellerin, what Freddy just talked about the risks and the consequences, not just for the African continent, but for the traditional partners of the African continent, namely Europe. What does it change for Europe, and what does it mean for what Europe will become in the coming decades? Well, that's a global question that you're asking me. It's not just about Africa. I think we need first to know where our interests lie. It's not a very easy question. Taking an example of France, who was on the front lines when it comes to what was happening in Western Africa and in the Sahel. Of course, French interests in that region have never been clearly defined by French authorities, and that led us to be in situations that were bigger than themselves and put them in very delicate situations with the local authorities. I'm thinking about Mali in particular. And let's dwell on this for a while. What happened in Mali answers your question. The risks are already there. Europe is losing market share, economically speaking. It's losing influence politically, geopolitically. So it doesn't take risks anymore. It doesn't own its positions. So what happened in Mali was that France wanted to help Mali, but was in the end waging war instead of Mali doing it. So Mali wanted to reaffirm its own strategic priorities, the way they would solve the conflicts at the north of the country, both the jihadist conflict and the rebel conflict. So what France couldn't do, they asked Russia to do. The city of Kidal, Russia took it without complaining about it, and the volumes of weaponry that was sent by Russia, France just couldn't send such volumes. And the question of human rights that was put forward by Europe was a hindrance for Mali, because you can't always wage war and respect the human rights. But those issues were not important to Russia. So all the blocking points in the war in Mali, well, Malian authorities found a solution in what Russia proposed. So the way France and Europe can get back on their feet, it would be to rethink the way they can meet the needs of African countries. Madame Traoré, anything to add to what Mathieu Pellerin just said? I think you're back. We can see you. Let's hope we can hear you. Yes, I hope you can hear me now. I think there's a major misunderstanding. And listening to Mathieu, I think that there's a war of narratives that was waged in such a way where it sounds like Mali was attacked by jihadists and asked France for help, and it didn't work, so we asked Russia for help, and they sent Wagner, and we know how it ended. But in my opinion, and this has been documented, I'm currently writing a piece on this, what Mali was expecting from France was not for France to deploy troops on the ground. So I do consider that Mali was attacked and that France had no intention of liberating Mali, because Serval was transformed into Barkhane unilaterally. And I was cut earlier when I was saying that what we are going through with Trump sheds light on what's happened in the Sahel and in Africa. Trump has many flaws, but he's paying us quite a service by showing us in a very crude light that everything is a question of interest. They say America first, France says France first, and they will try to come back. They will try to reconquer Africa. We have to expect that, because if they can't fight one another, they will wage their war on our territory. We need to understand that. And Africans need to show some political maturity. We paid a very hefty price for this economic model, starting from slavery days until today. I don't believe in this economic myth. Today, because we have minerals in the ground, we think that we're going to be able to develop just like all the others. But that makes me ask the question of the cultural model. It's a question of values. Africa needs to fight for its own values. And it needs to know that it has the duty today to rethink itself in terms of economic independence and not rush towards equity or weaponry. And I think we are at a turning point. And that sheds a new light on this discussion. I've been following what is going on in the West carefully, and they're not talking about Africa yet, but they will come because of the wealth of the continent. And I think that Freddy talked about agriculture. All of that is an option, of course, but it will require a full Pan-African vision, a concerted vision of our interests. We need to agree on what we mean by our interests. For the moment, we've only copied others. I say copy others because that's what China is selling to us. It's not clearly shown in the film, but our countries are flooded with means of transportation, such as motorbikes. And when the man goes to the market and whatever he buys, this little girl, she has hair clips, all of that, everything they buy comes from China. So China sells stuff to us and we buy everything. So they might be our friends, but we need to respect ourselves and be very demanding with ourselves. And depending on what we produce, what we consume, we will be able to get out of this situation or not. Thank you for this very clear intervention. Aisha, Dabo, we talked about state interests, economic powers, but what about the peoples? What are the interests of the peoples? And how can they get their voices heard? Well, if we're talking about the peoples, let me give you an example. My uncle, who lives in a very remote area in Senegal, what he's interested in is to know whether or not he will be able to care for his family. Does he have access to utilities, water, electricity? Can his children go to school? Is there a hospital nearby with skilled doctors to take care of them in case they get sick? So that's what the run-of-the-mill citizen is interested in. Now, how to go about it? Well, we need the right politicians. Madame Traoré talked about African values earlier. I personally do believe in African democracy, African governance. Each African country needs to identify what is their economic model, what is their governance model, and what their democracy looks like. As long as we don't take the time to think about that, we will only borrow models from elsewhere that not necessarily fit us, and that will lead to problems down the line. line.
Par rapport à ça. Maintenant, quand on parle
So
pour les
that's
populations, en termes de, prenons l'exemple
one
de la
very
Chine
important
qui vient
point.
investir et tout,
Now,
il y a un
taking the
film
example
que
of
je vais
China
regarder aussi, mais les questions
coming in
aussi
and
qui
investing,
se
I've
passent
seen
sur le
another
continent,
film
c'est les parcs
here
industriels,
on
ou bien,
industrial parks,
les grandes entreprises d'agro-business
large
qui signent avec
agro-food
l'État,
companies
et les
who
terres
sign
sont,
contracts with
retirées
the
des
states,
populations
and
pour donner cet espace-là, soit
land is
dans un
being
parc
grabbed
industriel ou
from the
bien
populations either to
pour
create
de
an industrial
l'agro-business.
park or for
Et les populations, c'est en ce
the
moment-là, en
agro-food
fait, qu'ils se
industry.
rendent compte
And
qu'il y
that's
a quelque chose
when
qui a été
populations
signé,
realize that something has
qui
been
n'est pas dans leurs
signed
intérêts et ils se lèvent.
that goes
Le film
against
dont
their
je parle,
interests.
qui est dans le festival Made in
The
Ethiopia,
film I'm
parle de
talking
cette
about
histoire-là
is
d'une
a
population,
film
d'une
of the
communauté
festival
qui a
called Made in
eu à se
Ethiopia.
battre
It's a
pour
film
que le
about a
parc
community
industriel
that
existant ne soit pas
fought
étendu. Donc c'est à ce moment-là,
against
quand la
the extension of
réellement les
an
populations,
existing industrial park.
qu'elles s'impliquent et qu'elles défendent leurs
So when the
droits. Par exemple, le droit à la
populations
terre est
realize that
fondamental.
this is an
Donc,
issue, then
par exemple, nous, ce que nous faisons
they stand
en
up and
tant
fight.
qu'organisation
The right to
activiste, c'est
have to own
sensibiliser
land
les populations
is
aux
essential.
réalités
So
de
what
comment fonctionnent
we
les
need to
systèmes dans
do is
lesquels
to
nous sommes.
raise awareness
Quand on
amongst
veut
the
parler de
population
séparation du pouvoir, quand on
and
parle
to
de prise
really
d'élection,
explain
quels
how
sont leurs droits,
separation
quelles
of
sont les
powers
responsabilités. Et
work,
ils ont aussi le
what
droit
their rights
de
are.
demander des
And
comptes
need to
aux
tell them
dirigeants.
that
Et
they
ça,
are allowed
on le
to
fait à
hold
travers
politicians
principalement le numérique.
accountable. That's something that
Et
we
nos
do through
principaux
digital
bénéficiaires, c'est les
technologies
jeunes qui
mostly.
sont
We mostly
la majeure
target the
partie
youth
ont des smartphones.
because most of them
Et
have smartphones.
je ne peux pas dire que directement, mais en tout cas des exemples d'élections, je peux dire depuis 2011
To give
en
you a few
Afrique de l'Ouest,
examples,
où
since
il y a eu cette
2011,
influence-là grâce au numérique pour que les
there's
gens
been
puissent
an
apporter des
influence thanks to
changements
digital
dans leur
technologies
pays et
that's helped
ensuite
people
demander des
bring
comptes.
about change in their countries
Suivre
and
est-ce que les promesses
hold
qui ont
politicians
été
accountable and follow on the
faites lors des
promises that
élections
they
ont
made
porté des
during the
fruits ou non.
elections.
Et ensuite, utiliser ces informations-là et sensibiliser les populations.
So we
Pas
use
seulement dans
this
les langues
information
officielles
and
français ou
we
anglais,
raise
mais dans les
awareness amongst the
langues
population, and
que
not
nous
just
parlons,
in
donc de langues
official
nationales,
languages,
parce que
French
je
or
n'aime pas les
English, but in the
langues locales, je dis
national
que c'est des langues nationales.
national
Donc,
languages. I don't
pour
like
que la
to call them
population
local
puisse
languages,
avoir
national
l'information
languages.
qu'il faut,
The idea
soit
is for
assez outillée pour que quand il faudra
population to
prendre
have
des
access to
décisions,
the right
qu'elle prenne
information
des
for them
décisions
to
en âme et conscience. Maintenant, si la
make
population choisit quelque
decisions
chose qui n'est pas nécessairement
knowingly.
bien vu, par exemple, il y a eu un sondage de Afrobarometer qui avait
For
demandé
example, there was
aux
a
jeunes que
poll by
pensent-ils des
Afrobarometer
régimes militaires. Certains ont dit que
asking the
nous
youth what they
préférons un
thought of
régime militaire qui marche
military
qu'un
regimes,
régime
and
civil
some of
qui ne
them
marche pas.
answered that they prefer a
Donc,
military regime
en
that's
tout cas, les gens
working than the
ont
civilian regime
la
that's not
possibilité de
working.
s'exprimer et
So
aussi peuvent choisir le type
people
de
can
gouvernance qu'ils veulent.
express
Et bien sûr,
themselves.
je vais
They
ajouter
need to
une
be
chose,
able
dans
to
le respect
choose a
des droits
type of
fondamentaux, parce que ça, c'est, pour
government
moi,
that
c'est
they
pas
want.
négociable.
Of course,
Ce que vous
still
êtes en train de nous dire, au
respecting
fond,
fundamental
peut-être,
rights.
si on devait répondre
I
à la
think that's a
question
non-negotiable.
qui est celle du débat de ce soir, Chine et Russie en Afrique, opportunités ou menaces.
So
Au fond, ce
if
que vous êtes en
we're
train de nous dire, c'est que
if we want to
la
answer the
réponse,
question
c'est
of
que vous
the
étiez en avoir
debate
une,
this
que
evening,
ce soit
China and Russia and
d'utiliser
Africa,
tous
opportunity
les
or
formes de la
threat, your
gouvernance
answer
dans les pays
would
africains. C'est
be
bien ça.
everything depends
C'est
on
ma
the
conviction.
mode of
Ça
governance
dépend de la
in African
gouvernance.
countries, right?
Je ne dirais pas à 100%, mais
Absolutely.
majoritairement.
I'm deeply
Parce que
convinced of
si
this. Maybe it doesn't depend on governance
les
100%, but
gens vont
mostly
négocier en pensant à des intérêts
governance will play a
à
role.
court terme ou des intérêts claniques,
Because if
ça ne
you
sert pas et
only
ça va
focus on
s'effondrer à un
short-term
moment donné.
interests
Et
or
ce qu'on
the
aimerait
interests of
éviter,
your
c'est qu'on
your
finisse par ouvrir les portes
group, then
et que nos
it will not work out.
populations en fait, se révoltent face à des étrangers pour créer une autre crise dont on n'a pas besoin. Donc,
What we
ceux
want
qui
to
vont,
avoid is our
négocier
populations
quelque
to
partenariat
raise
que ce soit,
against
que ça soit militaire,
foreign
économique,
power,
agricole,
which would
etc.,
create
doivent
tensions that we
pouvoir
don't need.
prendre en compte les réalités
So
de leur population
the realities of the populations need to be taken into account for all these investments to make sense for the populations, because it's all well and good to set up a business where all the supervisors are foreigners and locals only do the hardest work, and it's not skilled labor at all. So you were talking about increasing the level of skills. That's very important, because we can't continue depending on others. Then there's also the question of our education system. We would need to rethink it, because very often what the market requires is not what is being taught at university. So we would need to rethink the whole system. Now, is there a country where politicians are bold enough or crazy enough to start doing it? Because since our independence, many people have written about that, but no one has actually moved to do anything about it. Mathieu, maybe you want to add something? I fully agree with you. The way African countries think their relationship to the main powers need to be translated in the national roadmap.
La présence de certaines puissances militaires.
That's where the presence of some military powers do not necessarily help peace or stability, but once again, those are sovereign choices. And if some players want to or disapprove of this or want to oppose this, well, they will have to propose alternatives. Mr. Nkurikiye, before I give the floor to the audience, one last question. What would both old and new powers alike need to set up a partnership that would be, let's say, more egalitarian with African countries? Well, I think first, they need to understand that the partners that they used to have 20 or even 10 years ago have changed. Secondly, new doors have opened. A very simple example. A very skilled young African to go to Europe, it's very complicated to get a visa. But on the other hand, they can easily go to Turkey, they can easily go to China. And as you know, access to education has a strong influence on the relationship between countries and peoples. That's the first thing. The second thing is that African partners need to be able to define their priorities and their needs. What are those today? As you were saying earlier, African powers need more state and better state. A state that would be safe for everyone. That means a government that would be able to provide you with the means to take care of your family, that would enable you to create wealth and ensure your livelihood, ensure that you would have access to education, healthcare, and also security. That is fundamental. We were talking about governance, and that reminds me of the discussions that we're having at the African Union. The concept that best fits African countries, well, maybe we need to pluck up the courage to devise this new governance system. Maybe we need to put forward our values and do some advocacy work so that you understand what is needed in Africa. Because very often when we say advocacy, when we talk about Africa, it's not taken seriously. But Madame Traoré was talking about coming back to our values. Well, Africa's partners also need to understand that things have changed, and what used to be is not anymore and will not be tomorrow. So it's down to us as well to tell our partners, those are our needs, this is where we want to go, this is how we want to get there. Please accompany us there. And when a friend wants to accompany you, well, there are a certain number of conditions to respect if the way there needs to be pleasant. Thank you very much, Freddy, Mathieu, Pellerin, Aisha, Dabo, Aminata, Traoré. Are there any questions in the audience? We'll circulate microphones for questions from the floor. Thank you. I'm quite surprised that we're not talking about the situation in Bangui as presented in the program. I know someone who works there, and this person has explained quite a number of things to me. First of all, it's one of the poorest countries, and in Bangui, they've had Daesh coming up. And to fight Daesh, Wagner came in. And now Wagner settled around uranium mine, gold mines, and the president, who's corrupt, has lifted custom duties. So Russia is making a mint there, and the people are not seeing any of that money trickle down at all. What I'm saying here is that corruption is rife. There's no education, there are no jobs. Watching this film, I wanted to cry because it's the reality that my friends have been telling me about. And then there's precious woods being taken by the Chinese, and basically, Russia and China are pillaging the country, and the population is not getting anything from it. And when it comes to human rights, well, we're all shocked by the situation. So what you're saying is that partners change, but the situation remains the same, isn't it? Is it a question that you wanted to ask one of our panelists? Right, so this lady was asking, how can you change the way countries are governed?
I'll have a go. So the how is an important question. When the President Traoré was campaigning, I was in Bangui in 2013 during the war, so I know a little about everything that we saw on screen. And since the 60s, they have had no respite as the population. They have really had a hard time. Now, when there was the first presidential campaign, there was a lot of hope, and that is why there was that Boa song saying that they thought that as university professors, he would then be able to fight corruption. He would be able to establish the foundations so that the country could then develop. But then, a few years after he came to power, because we work with young people on the ground. Unfortunately, a young journalist who was investigating the president of Wagner was killed. So the civic space is quite limited, and this means that work is difficult. How to get there is difficult. I don't think there are any miracle solutions, but I know that young people on the ground in civil society are still working despite the risks and the difficulties on the ground. And I think this is something that we need to look up to. And I don't think we should despair, but the how, it really is how we would find the best solution. Another question.
Bonjour.
First of all, thank you for the discussion, and in particular to Aminata Traoré for giving us a different perspective on Africa. I had a couple of questions. First, I would like to ask a question about Russia to Mr. Pellerin. You said that there was an argument to show the effectiveness of Russia. You gave Mali as an example, and we've seen that in the last few years there have been a number of exactions carried out on civilians by Russia. There have also been a lot of problems regarding the cuts that were made to salaries. We've also seen that last summer in the north of the country, the Tuareg were attacked, and this was said to be the fault of the Malian army. So some of these difficulties are supposedly linked to cultural integration. For example, Russia in some areas has been kicked out in favor of the Rwandan army. So this is something that we see in different African conflicts. So what is the future of Russia based on what I have just listed? And in Central African Republic, we have seen that there has been doors slightly left open to France. And does this mean that Russia is ineffective there? And I'd also like to know the panelists' views on the development model that is being proposed in Senegal, which is a democratic example, and it seems a little bit like the example or the model that Aminata Traoré was trying to promote for Africa. First of all, thank you very much. Everything you've said is completely right. In fact, these exactions on the civilian population happened before Wagner. This has been something that has happened since 2016. And the way Wagner carries out war has only amplified the problem. But the whole issue behind this is how can you carry out counter-insurrection operations? How can you deal with the civilian population in these situations? This is not just the case in Mali, but in Niger as well. For us, a civilian is not necessarily seen as a civilian by the Malian army. If that person might be working in logistics, they might be seen as being associated with one of those groups. So I'm just highlighting the fact that this is another problem. So beyond a value judgment, what I'm saying is that that Russia provided help that other partners had not provided, or they went to areas where France did not want to go, for example, in areas of Mali. And as you said, Russia has not done this by improving things. This has worsened polarization amongst communities. The impacts are there. They have restored security in the north. We see that there are no longer permanent rebel groups in Mali. However, in the south, there has been an increase in violence, particularly by jihadists. But the reason Russia was invited was because other European partners could not provide the solutions that were asked for. I think there was a second question, which was to Madame Traoré. If you could briefly answer that.
Oui, je voudrais que
On va essayer de vous joindre. Est-ce que
We'll try and connect with you.
J'ai quand même le devoir de dire que la ici complexifier la situation parce que quand vous parlez
Russia has made the situation even more complex.
L'Ukraine s'est invitée dans la guerre au Mali pour en découdre avec ici. Que je dis que ce qui se passe en ce moment ne sera pas sans conséquence sur le traitement de la crise au Mali. Et pour faire court, il se dit beaucoup de choses. Je ne vais pas m'attarder sur la démocratie, la gouvernance.
I'm not going to spend much time on governance and democracy, but it seems that those solutions are not helping. It is clear that the Senegalese example is a lesson for us all. Things have worked well regarding the choice of leaders. And a number of the concerned countries are now being governed by young people who have the audacity to say no to Western powers. So we need to demand our sovereignty. And I think when we're talking about an alternative, when I talk about an alternative, I think these are the efforts that I am talking about. I don't think we have come to a solution yet, but in Africa we have spent a long time fighting for courageous leaders that will call a spade, and that has happened in Senegal. That has happened there, and in the three countries of the Sahel, I have a lot of hope. When we talk about the future, I think the future, the Africa of the future, will start in that part of the continent. Thank you, Madame Traoré. We will have the last question. I think we've already overrun, so perhaps can we have one more question after that? Please go ahead. Thank you very much. I have to say that I had very fixed ideas when I came here, but I have a question to the former minister regarding the challenges when we see the response that that African countries have to provide to health crises, for example, to fight HIV and malaria. Is China and Russia, are they partners to be able to help African countries for this?
fait possible tout. C'est ça que notre propre capacité et vision. Parce qu'il s'agit de laisser mener par une autre puissance dans le cadre des BRICS ou pas.
Well, it's not just about being receiving aid from another power, whether they're BRICS or not, but I think Africa will need to increase its capacity for analysis and production in light of what is happening at the moment, because USAID and the aid that they used to provide was very conditional. So we all lose in this situation. Healthcare, but also the climate issue. We didn't talk about it, but in our region, we know that Africa, which does not produce very much greenhouse gases, is paying a very hefty price for global warming. So climate, healthcare, education, agriculture, we need a new deal. And what African politicians need to do now is to ask the question, and because the world is becoming increasingly multipolar. Thank you. I hear that we can take one very last question, a very short question, and we'll get a very short answer as well. Please tell us who the question goes out to.
Because I don't speak very good French, but my question is about the political influence that such economic interests usually brings in the underdeveloped and developing nations. With regards to this, I see that the discussion has been pointing the blame very inwards. What do you think is the role of the international community and international organizations to prevent these superpowers from using these nations as their playground for war?
So your question is for?
The panel in general. Thank you.
Qui veut répondre? Quel est le rôle de la communauté internationale dans cette affaire? Qui souhaite peut-être ici sur le plateau?
Who would like to answer? Mathieu? Well, talking about the international community, that doesn't mean anything anymore, unfortunately, because we have conflicting positions, north-south, but also south-south and north-north. There is no such a thing as the international community anymore. There are African countries where, on the basis of the situation, in their domestic situation, call for support to different power. And then there are other countries that are profiting from a vulnerable situation to advance their own interests. For example, with the example of Sudan, Russia is supporting both parties to the conflict. First, they used to support the rebels, but then they realized that they had more to gain by supporting the Sudanese army. So through Wagner, they've worked with the RSF, and then Russia then turned to the official army. So to answer your question, well, it is hard to tell whether or not Russia coming in will be positive or not. It's down to the African countries to decide what they're going to make of it. And the question that we can ask ourselves is whether or not in Europe we can offer an alternative that meets the need of African countries. And until today, well, nothing has been proposed. There is no defense policy. European states do not have any defense policy for Africa, aside from France, but France is on the sidelines for the moment. Europe has no clear project to promote in Africa, even in terms of economic development. As Freddy was saying, is still in an aid logic with filters, gender, environmental protection, and so on, without taking into account of the priorities of the African countries. So the
céder en aidant.
question we need to ask ourselves is whether or not Europe wants to help itself by helping others, or does it really want to contribute to development?
Merci à vous. Merci Mathieu.
Thank
Merci
you.
Aisha. Merci à nos
Thank you, Mathieu, Aisha.
depuis le continent africain. Freddy,
Thanks to
Nkurikiye,
the
Aminata,
panelists
Traoré. Merci à
online
vous
from
pour
Africa,
vos questions
Freddy, Nkurikiye and
pertinentes
Aminata
et intéressantes.
Traoré.
Et je vous souhaite une bonne soirée, une bonne suite de festival.
Thank you all. Have a lovely evening and enjoy the rest of the festival.